Hey everybody, today I've flown out here to Wyoming to take a look at the refreshed 2020 GMC Acadia. The Acadia is the mid-sized SUV in the GMC lineup. This is a little bit bigger than their two-row vehicle and quite a bit shorter than the Yukon overall. But the Acadia has changed over time, and this generation of the Acadia got considerably smaller than the last generation. The reduced dimensions have put this in direct competition with the Highlander and the Pilot. In the past, it was a little bit larger. And they're positioning this as the more premium or more off-road oriented entry in this particular segment, especially with this new AT4 trim. Up front, we see GM's latest design language. They've grafted the front end from their pickup truck line onto the Acadia for this generation. So we have these dishes down there and a very similar grille to what we see in the pickup truck line. We have full LED headlamps across the lineup now, and then fog lamps down below if you choose that option. Although GMC is positioning this as the off-road oriented Acadia, we don't find any tow hooks up front like we do find in the pickup line. Since 2020 is a refresh, not a complete redesign of the Acadia, the overall dimensions haven't changed. That puts this pretty exactly between the Honda Pilot and the Toyota Highlander in terms of overall length, notably shorter than the Chevy Traverse. In the past, GM had a few different vehicles that were right about the same length from the different brands. But with this generation, they decided to split things up and make the Acadia a little bit smaller to more directly compete with things like the Highlander or the Pilot, and then have something like the Chevy Traverse and the Buick Enclave that are definitely on the longer side. The rear end styling has also gotten a little bit of an update for 2020. We have tail lamp modules that circle on over here to the liftgate, dual exhaust tips down below, and behind this little hatch right here, you'll find the tow hitch receiver. Towing comes in at 4,000 pounds if you choose the V6. In addition to refreshing the outside, GMC also decided to refresh the engine lineup for 2020. We still have a 2.5-liter four-cylinder naturally aspirated engine in the base model, very similar to what we see going on in the Highlander lineup, that produces 193 horsepower. Then we get this V6 optional. It produces 310 horsepower and 271 pound-feet of torque. Those are basically the same engines that we saw for 2019. The difference for both of those engines is that they're now mated to a 9-speed automatic transmission that was designed in-house by General Motors. That means it does not shift like the 9-speed automatic that we see in Honda, Acura, and of course some of the Jeep models out there. It's an awful lot smoother. So if you've heard bad things about 9-speed automatic transmissions out there, remember that those complaints do not apply to this transmission because it's a completely different unit. The other big change for 2020 is that we now have a 2-liter turbocharged four-cylinder engine under this hood, mated to that same 9-speed automatic transmission. An interesting touch with this new 2-liter turbo under here is that it will employ cylinder deactivation, which makes it one of the very few four-cylinders in the world that has that fuel-saving feature. Front seat comfort is overall pretty good in the Acadia, although I do wish this front seat had a 4-way adjustable lumbar support. I think that would be a little bit more in keeping with GMC's premium message. Some of the competition, especially some of the newer competition to this, does have a 4-way lumbar support. However, we do have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, and overall I found the front seats quite comfortable for my body shape. However, shorter and taller drivers may have more of a difficulty finding a good driving position. It's worth noting that like most of the Asian competition, the front passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. It is missing the 2-way lumbar. Hopping into the back seat, we find about the same kind of room back here that we find in the Pilot and Highlander, just a little bit more than either of those options at the moment, but definitely less than the larger entries in this segment, like the Chevy Traverse or the new Kia Telluride. The second row seats do recline, have a pretty decent range of motion to them overall, and they also slide forward and backward to help you apportion the space a little bit more equitably with the third row in the back. Like the Highlander and the Pilot, the Acadia's third row really ought to be considered an emergency use third row rather than a daily use third row. If you plan on using your third row regularly, then you might want to take a look at some of the larger options in this segment. But as far as emergency use third rows go, this is still pretty accommodating back here, most notably the headroom. My head is touching the ceiling right back here if I lean all the way back, but if I'm sitting in sort of a more natural position, then I have about an inch of headroom left. It's just due to the overall shape of the ceiling. It does dish down right back there towards the rear opening. The seats offer a little bit of recline functionality. This is the most reclined position. There's also a more upright position to square off the cargo area in the back. We have some cup holders here on either side and one USB charge port on that other side. Note that the second row seat is not all the way back in its tracks. It could move about 3 inches rearward, so you'd see that that really would be digging into my knees if I were to move that all the way back. Behind the rear hatch, we find just under 13 cubic feet of storage space, so this is pretty in line with the Pilot and the Highlander, but definitely smaller than we see in something like the Chevy Traverse, or of course those new larger SUVs and crossovers. Something like the Volkswagen Atlas will definitely have a larger cargo area back here. Again, these rear seats can be put in a more upright position. You can do that from right back here. That will square off the cargo area just a little bit, right like that, and it will give you a little bit more room for some roller bags if you were to try and put them in an upright position right like that and you still wanted to be able to close the hatch. But it's going to make it a lot less comfortable for the third row passengers. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the AT4, which is ostensibly the off-road capable version. We have a dual sunroof setup here, so we have a sunroof right there over the driver and front passengers' heads, and then one over the second row as well. Up front, we have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, AT4 embroidered right there on the headrests, and then this vehicle has a two-tone leather interior. The seats in this trim feature perforated inserts on the seat back and seat bottom cushion, although these seats are not ventilated, they're just heated. As we move on from the doors on over to the dashboard, we find some slight restyling. You can see that the overall shape is similar to the 2019, but all the materials are a little bit tweaked for 2020. We have a pretty standard sized glove compartment right down there. It's a bin style. I was able to fit a medium-sized tablet computer in there. Moving over to the center console, we find GMC's latest infotainment software. This is very similar to what we see in the 2020 Sierra lineup. This features Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and a number of integrated app features. We also have a Wi-Fi hotspot there. There's some physical buttons down below, dedicated power and volume knob right there. Below that, we have the controls for the front two climate control zones. This does have the tri-zone climate control. There's a separate knob in the back for that. And then we have GMC's new pull and push shifter design here. Park is a button, low is a button, and then reverse is a pull-back toggle, so is drive right like that, and then neutral is a button for some reason. So you do have to get a little bit used to this shifter combination. It does take up a little bit less room in the center console, as you can see. That's the main reason that GMC moved to that particular shifter design, but it does take a little bit of getting used to. I have to say that the one thing that I found a little bit annoying is the low mode over here. So if we're in drive, we hit low and you want to move up and down gears, you have to use these buttons rather than paddles on the back of a shifter. That's not quite as handy as I would like. But it does auto park itself, so if you forget to put the vehicle in park and you turn it off, it'll automatically engage the park mode right there. We have two USB inputs right there in the center console, definitely enough room to store some of those larger smartphones. There's a 12-volt power outlet there as well. Behind that, we have a button to disable the auto start-stop system, so if you were upset about GMC not allowing you to disable that system before, we have that option here. Button to disable the parking sensors right there. Two decently sized cup holders right in the middle. Controls for the heated seats, and then the all-wheel drive system. Like we see in some other recent GM vehicles, this defaults to two-wheel drive operation. So if you want four-wheel drive operation, you have to toggle this over there to the all-wheel drive operation, to the sport mode, the mountain mode, etc. Between the front seats, we find a soft armrest, and then a decently sized storage cubby. Although there are some USB cables in there, there are no USB ports in there. Over on the driver's side, we have a partial LCD instrument cluster. You can see we have the 4 standard gauges there, and then a color multifunction display in the middle that gives us a bunch of different readouts, very similar to GMC's truck lineup. And the steering wheel design is overall pretty similar to some of the rest of GMC's crossovers out there. We have fairly aggressive sport grips up top. It's a 4-spoke design. You'll find the infotainment controls on the back of the steering wheel, track up and down on the left, volume up and down over there on the right. The controls on the right control that multifunction LCD between the speedometer and tachometer. And then if we move on over to the right side, we find the controls for the cruise control system. Even though we have a distance button here that's just for the collision alert system, this does not feature radar adaptive cruise control at this time. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to spend as much time as I would like in the new Acadia, but I have to say that this definitely feels a little bit different than the last model out on the road. Obviously, the big difference is the new 9-speed automatic transmission. Again, this does not drive at all like the 9-speed that we find in Honda, Acura, or Jeep models. This transmission is an awful lot quicker shifting, but it doesn't have quite the same range of gear ratios that we see in that ZF 9-speed automatic transmission. The ZF has a very low first gear and a fairly high final gear, giving you good fuel economy and excellent acceleration. The trouble with that transmission design, of course, is that it feels peculiar out on the road. And even though GM had to give up that broad ratio spread that we find in the ZF transmission, I think it was a worthwhile trade-off because this is an awful lot smoother. And it really does have a positive impact on performance. The last Acadia we tested went 0 to 60 in 6.8 seconds. I suspect this is probably going to be about a half second faster with the exact same engine under the hood. You'll have to wait until we can get our hands on one of these for a complete week so we can run it through our usual tests, but I'm going to go ahead and suspect that the overall 60-0 braking score is going to be basically the same as the last Acadia. Overall handling ability is likely going to be pretty similar. GM does a very nice front-wheel drive based platform, and I don't expect this to deviate from that formula very much. It definitely has a nice solid feel out on the road. If you want one of the more engaging crossovers in this segment, that's certainly going to be something like the new Ford Explorer, but this is definitely very in keeping with the likes of the Pilot and of course the Highlander. And those are really the more direct competitors for the Acadia anyway. Unfortunately, GMC had only one trim level available for testing. It's this AT4 model with the 3.6-liter V6, so I've been unable to test the base 4-cylinder engine or the optional 2-liter turbo. But personally, I think that the 2-liter turbo is probably the most interesting engine available under the hood, because there aren't too many alternatives in this particular segment at the moment that offer a smaller displacement turbocharged engine. And coupled with the 9-speed automatic transmission and the cylinder deactivation ability, I suspect it's going to be a very, very popular option. Since I haven't been driving this at home, it's a little bit difficult to talk about cabin noise and overall fuel economy, but again, I suspect this is going to be fairly similar in terms of cabin noise to the outgoing model, and you should expect fuel economy to perhaps improve slightly in real-world driving. Now, as we've seen with other GM models, when they've moved into this new 9-speed automatic transmission, it hasn't been accompanied by an EPA improvement in fuel economy, but in our real-world tests, we have noticed a very slight bump. That's just due to the overall gear ratios involved in this transmission versus the outgoing transmissions. GM focused this transmission on overall performance and drivability improvements, and overall fuel economy improvements weren't as high of a priority for them with this particular setup. For 2020, the Acadia is up against some pretty stiff competition, but it does fairly well overall. If you want the most fuel-efficient entry in this segment, that's likely going to be the new 2020 Highlander Hybrid. If you want the best handling entry in this segment, that's probably going to be something like the Acura MDX. But the MDX is more expensive than the Acadia when you comparably equip it. The MDX also comes with a few compromises, most notably the 9-speed automatic transmission that Honda chose to use in that particular model. Overall, out on the road, I have to say that the one thing that bugged me with this vehicle is the lack of shift paddles on the back of the steering wheel and the lack of a traditional shifter with a manumatic mode. We do have those buttons over there on the center console where you can change gears, but if you're trying to drive the Acadia, especially the V6 Acadia Denali, in a sporty fashion, that just doesn't really compensate for shift paddles that we would find on a lot of the competition, the Acura MDX especially. Hopefully that's something that GMC could remedy relatively easily, because they do have steering wheels with shift paddles. Unfortunately, this is not one of them. As with the 2019 Acadia, the 2020 Acadia is still sort of a tweener vehicle. It sits between some of the mainstream options and some of the near luxury options like an Acura MDX in terms of overall price. A top-end Denali V6 will be just about $47,000. That makes comparisons a little bit tricky with the Acadia. Obviously, you will have to wait until we can get our hands on this for a complete week so we can run it through our usual battery of comparisons and tests. But the lower-end Acadias are definitely direct competitors to the Pilot and, of course, the Highlander, whereas the top-end models are logical alternatives to something like the Acura MDX. And that does mean that the Acadia overall has a little bit of a split personality, because the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine is going to be notably slower than some of the alternatives out there, especially some of the mainstream alternatives that have V6 engines standard, but it's going to be right in the same bucket as the Toyota Highlander. Meanwhile, the Denali V6 with 310 horsepower and a 9-speed automatic transmission is definitely going to be in solid competition with the Acura MDX. Speaking of the V6, the minimum point of entry for that engine is the SLE trim at $37,490, and the minimum point of entry apparently for the 2-liter turbo is also the SLE trim at $36,200. So you can see that the V6 is a slightly more premium option over that 2-liter turbo. Now, the 2-liter turbo won't be available immediately at launch. It's coming a little bit later for the 2020 model year. Be sure and let me know what you think about the GMC Acadia down there in the comment section below. I have to say that if you're looking for something that's a little bit easier to park than the Kia Telluride or Hyundai Palisade, something in that next category up, but you want something that's a little bit more premium on the inside, especially then something along the lines of a Honda Pilot, you ought to give the Acadia a good look. The Pilot, I have to say, hasn't aged quite as well as the Acadia overall. Honda recently gave it a little bit of a refresh, but the interior definitely doesn't feel as modern as this GMC Acadia. But again, you'll have to wait until we can get our hands on one of these for a complete week so we can run it through our usual battery of comparisons and tests. In the meantime, let me know what you think about this car down there in the comment section below. If you haven't already done so, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next week.